They watching, 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 watching. They watching.
Today we're diving into some of the heaviest questions the 20th century ever had to face. Questions that were answered with unthinkable violence. And honestly, they're still echoing in our world today.
So right at the heart of what we're talking about today are these two huge questions. And they aren't just for a history textbook, right? They're the kind of questions that force us all to think about our own moral responsibilities, whether we're leaders or just ordinary citizens. We're going to trace exactly how an entire continent ended up grappling with them.
You'd think our story would begin with a war, but actually, it kicks off with a peace treaty. The end of World War I in 1919 was supposed to be the start of lasting stability. But instead, the Treaty of Versailles ended up planting the seeds for the very next conflict.
For Germany, this wasn't a negotiation. It was what they called a diktat, a dictated peace. Just think about it. German leaders weren't even invited to the talks. They were just handed a document and forced to sign it. For the whole nation, it was a profound humiliation, a punishment fueled by what the French called revanchism, a deep-seated desire for revenge.
And when you look at the terms, you can see exactly how this humiliation was written into law. It wasn't just about losing. I mean, look at Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It literally forced Germany to accept the entire moral blame for the war. Then you pile on crippling financial payments, a military that's been dismantled, and huge losses of territory. Well, you get a deep, collective resentment that's just going to simmer for decades.
So, you take all that simmering resentment, and then you throw in a devastating global economic collapse. It was the perfect storm. All across Europe, people started to lose faith in the slow, messy process of democracy and began looking for stronger, more decisive leaders.
What's absolutely terrifying is just how fast everything fell apart. The 1929 Wall Street crash wasn't just a financial crisis. It was a political catalyst. In Germany, as unemployment shot through the roof, the democratic government seemed completely powerless. And in that kind of desperation, where do people turn? They turn to extremist parties who promise radical, simple solutions.
So here's the crucial point. For many people at the time, it felt like a real choice between two very different futures. On one side, you had democracy, which just seemed chaotic and weak. On the other side, you had totalitarianism, fascism, communism, Nazism, and they were all offering order, national pride, and strength. The only price? Your individual freedom.
Now, as these aggressive, expansionist regimes started getting bolder, the rest of the world faced a new test. Were the other nations going to stand up and do something?
The policy the world settled on was something called appeasement. You have to remember, leaders in Britain and France were completely haunted by the memory of World War I. They were desperate to avoid another war like that. So, they chose to give in to Hitler's demands, hoping it would satisfy him and keep the peace.
The first big test came in 1938. Hitler's army just marches into Austria, creating the Anschluss, or Union. This was a clear violation of the Versailles Treaty. And the world's response? Silence. Nothing. Hitler learned a very important lesson that day. He could act aggressively, and there would be no consequences.
Just 6 months later, he's at it again. This time, he demands the Sudetenland, a region of Czechoslovakia. So, at the Munich conference, what do Britain and France do? They agree. They give it to him, sacrificing another country to avoid a war. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, flew home declaring he had achieved peace for our time.
But of course, there was no peace. By March 1939, Hitler breaks his promise and his armies swallow up the rest of Czechoslovakia. It was now brutally, painfully clear that appeasement hadn't bought peace at all. It had only fed Hitler's hunger for Lebensraum, or living space, and made a massive war completely inevitable. And that very same logic, the logic of inaction and silence, played out with truly horrific consequences inside Germany itself. The Holocaust didn't happen all at once. It was a gradual, bureaucratic process. Each step, from propaganda that dehumanized Jewish people, to laws that stripped them of their rights, to herding them into ghettos, was met with a silence that enabled the next, more terrible step, until it culminated in the unimaginable horror of the final solution.
After 60 million people were dead, after the world discovered unspeakable horrors, the end of World War II wasn't just a victory. It was a moment of global reckoning. The world had to finally face what it had allowed to happen.
The philosopher Hannah Arendt, who covered the trial of a key Nazi organizer, put her finger on something she called the banality of evil. She argued that the greatest evils in history are often committed not by monsters, but by ordinary people, bureaucrats who just stop thinking for themselves, who simply follow orders, and who surrender their own moral conscience.
The Nuremberg trials were a direct response to that very idea. For the first time ever, a new standard for international justice was set. Leaders could be held individually responsible for their actions. "I was just following orders" was no longer a valid defense. These trials created brand new categories of crime, like crimes against peace, and most importantly, crimes against humanity, to make sure genocide could be prosecuted.
In the aftermath, the world scrambled to build a better, safer system. The United Nations was founded to promote diplomacy over war. The whole idea of universal human rights started to become a reality. But even as the world tried to heal, new fractures appeared. Germany was split in two, kicking off the Cold War, and the invention of the atomic bomb introduced a terrifying new moral reality.
So, in a way, the 20th century itself was put on trial. But the questions it raised, they're timeless. They confront every single generation, just in new ways. So we're going to end by turning that question back to you. When you are faced with injustice, what will your verdict be?
Signal detected. Firewall breach. Begin transmission. They watching. They watching.